Hey guys, tonight we begin with a drug that doesn't knock you out so much as it reaches into your own personal timeline and quietly deletes a chapter while you're still standing in it. Versed, the hospital sedative famous for one very specific party trick. It doesn't just calm you down, it edits you, live, in real time, while you smile, chat, occasionally insult a nurse, and remember absolutely none of it. Imagine if your phone could selectively delete certain texts the moment you sent them, except the phone is you, and the texts are an entire colonoscopy. Before we get into it, a genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. Comment suggestions are the actual engine of this channel, and every single one gets read. Even the ones written at 3 in the morning in what I can only assume was a Versed-adjacent state of mind. If you're enjoying tonight's trip into the chemistry of forgetting, a like and a subscribe always helps, but only if you actually mean it, and only if you remember to do it, which, given tonight's topic, is no longer something I take for granted. We're also now live on Spotify, so if you'd rather drift off without a screen, there's a link in the description waiting for you. Now go ahead and dim the lights, get the fan humming for that soft static hush, and settle in somewhere you don't mind losing track of time, because tonight, losing track of time is the whole point. Have you ever wondered why you can have a full conversation with an anesthesiologist and remember none of it 10 minutes later? Have you ever woken up from a procedure laughing at a joke you apparently told but cannot recall writing? Have you ever wondered what your brain is actually doing in the gap between rolling into the operating room and waking up, asking if it's already over only to be told it's been 2 hours? Would you trust a tiny glass vial to take your most anxious, white-knuckled self and turn her into someone who calmly tells a nurse her childhood dog's full government name? Could you survive a single hour of your own consciousness if you knew, with total certainty, that none of it would survive past breakfast? And now, congratulations, you've just been wheeled into a pre-op bay, paper gown, mismatched socks, and an IV line already taped into the back of your hand. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse is holding a syringe, smiling at you in a way that should probably be illegal, and in about 90 seconds you're not going to remember any of this. Good luck. You're lying on a gurney that has clearly seen better decades, staring up at a ceiling tile with a water stain shaped vaguely like a state you've never visited. And somewhere in your chest is the particular anxiety reserved for situations where you've signed paperwork you didn't fully read. You're not having surgery exactly. You're having a procedure, which is medical shorthand for something unpleasant enough to require drugs, but not quite dramatic enough to require an actual surgeon's full attention. The nurse asks if you're nervous, and you say no, in the exact tone of someone who is extremely nervous. She doesn't push it. She's heard that no 1,000 times in 1,000 variations from 1,000 people clutching the rail of a gurney like it personally owes them an explanation. The room smells like antiseptic and the particular plastic of blood pressure cuffs, a smell your nose will now associate with vulnerability for the rest of your life. Somewhere a monitor beeps in a rhythm that's supposed to be reassuring, but mostly sounds like a tiny robot counting down to something. You're wearing a gown that ties in the back, which is a design choice that has never once made anyone feel powerful. Your socks don't match because you grabbed them in the dark at 5 in the morning, and now an anesthesiologist you've known for exactly 90 seconds is going to witness this fashion failure up close. You think about all the things you should have asked before agreeing to this, how long it'll take, whether you'll drool, whether you'll say anything embarrassing. You did not ask these things. You signed where the arrow pointed and trusted the system, the same way you trust a parking garage elevator, not to drop you 4 floors, which is to say with a faith built entirely on the absence of an alternative. A nurse checks your IV line, taps it twice like she's testing a melon, and tells you everything looks great, which is a phrase medical professionals use roughly the way weather forecasters use a slight chance of rain. Technically informative, practically meaningless. you're not having surgery. You remind yourself again, you're having a procedure. And somehow that distinction feels important, even though your body, lying flat under a thin blanket with a needle taped into the back of your hand, does not seem to care about the vocabulary. Somewhere down the hall someone laughs, a real laugh, the kind that suggests this place isn't entirely defined by dread, and you cling to that sound the way you'd cling to a buoy. The fluorescent lights overhead hum at a frequency that feels specifically engineered to remind you that time is, in fact, passing, slowly, deliberately, and with your full, unmedicated awareness. This is the last stretch of your life you're guaranteed to remember today, and you don't even know it yet. You're just lying there, mismatched socks and all, waiting for someone to tell you it's time, completely unaware that its time is about to mean something very different from what you think. Somewhere on a tray beside you sits a small glass vial, no bigger than your thumb, filled with a clear liquid that looks like it could just as easily be saline or tap water, or, frankly, nothing at all. It is not nothing. That little vial is about to do something water has never managed to do in the entire history of hydration. Convince your brain to stop filing paperwork. Verse doesn't knock politely. It walks straight into your hippocampus, the part of your brain responsible for forming new memories, and quietly unplugs the recorder. The nurse draws it up into a syringe with the casual efficiency of someone who has done this exact motion thousands of times, the same way you might flip a light switch without thinking about electricity. You watch the syringe the way you'd watch a magician's hands, half expecting something dramatic, a puff of smoke, a flash of light, anything to signal that your consciousness is about to take an unscheduled vacation. Nothing about the liquid looks dangerous. It doesn't fizz, it doesn't glow, it doesn't smell like anything, because you can't smell anything that hasn't left the vial yet. This is the strange comedy of modern pharmacology. The most consciousness-altering substances often look like the least interesting things in the room, sitting quietly next to cotton balls and tongue depressors like they're just another office supply. The nurse connects the syringe to your IV port with a small click, and for a moment nothing happens at all, which is its own kind of unsettling, because you've built up the moment in your head, and the universe has decided to deliver it at the pace of a slow Tuesday. Then she begins to push the plunger, slowly, steadily, and you feel a faint coolness travel up your arm, like a small stream of weather moving through your veins. You try to focus on the feeling, to really notice it, because some instinct in you understands that this is your last chance to notice anything for a while. Your eyelids get heavier with a speed that feels almost rude, like they've been waiting for permission this whole time and finally got it. The room doesn't go dark exactly, it goes softer, the edges of things losing their urgency, the beeping monitor losing its threat. You try to finish a thought and discover, with mild curiosity rather than alarm, that you can't quite locate where the thought went. It's a strange kind of forgetting, not loss exactly, more like watching a sentence dissolve before you finish writing it. Somewhere in the part of your brain still technically operational, you register that the tiny vial has won, decisively, without raising its voice. And the truly absurd part is that you, the person currently being chemically rewritten in real time, are not going to remember a single second of this happening, including the part where you found it absurd. Long before anyone handed you a syringe and a reassuring smile, medical procedures ran on a much blunter toolkit: whiskey, leather restraints, and the heroic willpower of a patient who had simply decided not to scream. Surgeons of earlier centuries operated at a speed that would make modern fast food workers look leisurely, because speed was the only anesthesia available. If you needed a limb removed in the early 1800s, your best hope wasn't medicine. It was a surgeon who'd done it enough times to finish before you fully processed what was happening. There was no consent form because there was no need for one. Consent was implied the moment gangrene set in, and your other options narrowed to one: The operating theatre, and yes, theatre was the correct word because people genuinely came to watch, smelled like sawdust and old blood, and the sawdust wasn't decoration. It was there to soak up what the floor couldn't handle. A surgeon's reputation rested almost entirely on speed. One famous practitioner of the era was said to amputate a leg in under 3 minutes. A statistic that sounds impressive until you remember the patient was fully, screamingly conscious for every one of those 180 seconds. Patients were given whiskey, sometimes a leather strap to bite, sometimes nothing more than a few strong assistants whose entire job was to hold the body still, while the body did everything in its power not to be held still. Imagine the modern equivalent, walking into urgent care for a sprained ankle and being handed a shot of bourbon and a firm handshake before someone reaches for a saw. There was no concept of pain management as a goal in itself. Pain was simply the toll you paid for survival, and you paid it loudly in front of an audience, while medical students took notes on technique rather than mercy. Some surgeons developed almost theatrical showmanship, narrating their incisions to the gallery like a particularly grim cooking demonstration. The patients, understandably, remembered every second of it, assuming they survived long enough to remember anything, because infection killed more people than the actual surgery did, turning a successful operation into a slow-motion tragedy a week later. There was no version of conscious sedation, no twilight, no gentle fog to soften the edges. There was only before and after, with an excruciatingly vivid during sandwiched in between, fully witnessed, fully felt, and fully burned into memory in a way that modern medicine has spent the last 2 centuries trying very hard to undo. It's almost funny, in the darkest possible way, to think that an entire branch of pharmacology eventually formed around one single goal, making sure nobody ever has to remember this again. The leather strap is a museum piece now. The whiskey is just whiskey again. And somewhere in a hospital 10 minutes from your house, a tiny vial does in one quiet syringe what an entire profession used to do with brute force and a prayer. In the early 1900s, a German technique called twilight sleep promised something radical. Not the absence of pain, but the absence of remembering it. Doctors combined morphine and scopolamine to put labouring women into a state where they screamed, writhed and gave birth, then woke up later with no memory of any of it, as if their own childbirth had been performed by a stunt double. It was marketed as mercy, and in fairness, for women who had spent generations being told that suffering through labour was simply part of the deal, the idea of skipping straight to the part where you're handed a baby and told congratulations sounded less like medicine and more like a miracle with paperwork. Clinics specialising in the technique sprang up, particularly popular among women wealthy enough to afford the procedure and desperate enough to want an exit from an experience that medicine, up to that point, had offered absolutely no relief from. The process itself was not gentle. Scopolamine doesn't sedate so much as scramble. It produces a strange, disoriented state in which the body continues to function, continues to labour, continues to do everything labour requires, while the conscious mind drifts somewhere just out of reach of its own experience. Women under its effect sometimes thrashed violently enough that hospitals began strapping patients to beds, padding the rails, dimming the rooms, anything to manage bodies that were, for all practical purposes, unsupervised by the minds that owned them. The irony, of course, is staggering. The technique that promised peaceful, painless birth often involved women being physically restrained, while screaming through a labour they would later have zero memory of, which raises an uncomfortable question that nobody at the time seemed eager to ask out loud. If a woman is in genuine, visible distress, does it actually matter whether she remembers it afterward? Twilight Sleep didn't answer that question. It simply sidestepped it entirely, betting that the absence of memory was close enough to the absence of suffering to call it a win. And in a strange way, it worked, at least from a marketing perspective. Women emerged from the haze with no recollection of pain, genuinely believing, because they had no evidence to the contrary, that the whole thing had been gentle and quick. The method eventually fell out of favour as obstetric medicine advanced, and as the ethical oddness of inducing total amnesia in a screaming restrained patient became harder to ignore. But the core idea it introduced never really left medicine. Forgetting, it turned out, could be packaged and sold as comfort, even when the actual lived experience underneath it remained loud, physical, and entirely real. Wurst didn't invent that idea. It simply perfected it, refined it, made it shorter and safer, and considerably less likely to require a leather strap. But the philosophical bet underneath both drugs is exactly the same. If you can't remember suffering, were you really there for it? Modern medicine still hasn't fully answered that question. It's just gotten much, much better at making sure you don't think to ask it until well after the fact. Wurst didn't appear out of nowhere. It's the great-grandchild of a chemical lineage that started with Librium in the late 1950s and exploded into the cultural phenomenon known as Valium in the 1960s. These benzodiazepines calmed anxious housewives, soothed entire decades of suburban tension, and made a quiet fortune for a pharmaceutical industry that had just discovered relaxation could be bottled. Valium became so culturally embedded that it earned its own nickname, Mother's Little Helper, a phrase that managed to sound both affectionate and faintly damning at the same time, like calling a tranquilizer a casserole dish. Doctors prescribed it freely, for anxiety, for insomnia, for the general low hum of dissatisfaction that apparently afflicted an entire generation of women expected to keep a spotless house while feeling absolutely nothing about it. The drug worked by leaning on the same GABA receptors that Versed would later use, just with a slower onset and a much longer stay, the chemical equivalent of a houseguest who shows up gently and then doesn't leave for several days. This created a problem that the pharmaceutical industry would spend decades trying to solve. How do you get the calming benefits of a benzodiazepine without the lingering fog that follows it around like a clingy ex? Patients on Valium for anxiety didn't mind the long half-life much. Calm for a full day sounded like a feature, not a bug. But for hospitals trying to sedate someone for a 20-minute procedure, a drug that hung around in the system for the better part of a day was about as useful as a parachute that only opens after you have already landed. What doctors needed was something fast, something that arrived quickly, did its job thoroughly, and then politely excused itself from the body before the patient had even finished their recovery room crackers. The entire benzodiazepine family tree, from Librium's hesitant first branch to Valium's wildly successful canopy, was essentially one long experiment in finding the right balance between calm and control, between sedation and speed. Chemists kept tweaking the molecular structure, shortening it here, adjusting a ring there, trying to engineer a version that behaved less like a house guest and more like a contractor who shows up, does excellent work, and leaves before dinner. Wurst is the result of that decades-long tweaking, the answer to a question Librium and Valium never quite managed to solve. It kept the family's signature trick, that gentle flood of calm through the GABA receptors, but stripped away the lingering hours of fog that made its ancestors better suited for anxious housewives than anesthesia patients. In a strange way, every time Versed slides into someone's IV line before a colonoscopy, it's the great-grandchild of suburban 1960s tranquility finally finding its true calling, faster, sharper, and considerably less interested in sticking around for the casserole. In 1975, a chemist named Armin Welser, working at Hoffmann La Roche in Switzerland, synthesized a new benzodiazepine that behaved unlike any of its relatives. Most benzodiazepines of the era were stubbornly fat-soluble, meaning they refused to dissolve cleanly in water, which made injecting them into a vein about as graceful as trying to mix oil into soup. Welser's new molecule did something clever. Depending on the acidity around it, it could switch its personality, becoming water-soluble in the syringe and then fat-soluble the moment it crossed into the bloodstream. It's the chemical equivalent of someone who shows up to a job interview in a perfectly tailored suit, and then, the instant they're hired, changes into something far more comfortable for the actual work. Welser wasn't trying to invent a forgetting machine. He was solving a much more mundane, much more practical problem, the kind of unglamorous chemistry that rarely gets a movie made about it, but quietly reshapes how millions of people experience hospitals. Picture a laboratory in Basel, late in the evening, fluorescent lights humming the same dull tone they would later hum over your own pre-op gurney. Except here the only patient is a flask. Welser tested the molecule's behaviour across different pH levels, watching it shift its solubility like a chemical chameleon, and somewhere in that quiet, unglamorous repetition, he landed on a compound that would eventually be named midazolam. He had no way of knowing, standing there with his notebook and his Bunsen burner, that he'd just designed the active ingredient in millions of forgotten colonoscopies, dental extractions and emergency room shoulder relocations. He was thinking about solubility curves, not comedy gold. The compound moved through the usual gauntlet of testing, animal trials, then human trials, each step quietly confirming what Welser's careful tweaking had promised. A benzodiazepine that dissolved cleanly for injection, acted quickly once inside the body, and left just as fast as it arrived. It's a strange kind of legacy for a scientist to spend a career solving a technical solubility puzzle and end up decades later as the invisible reason an entire generation of nervous patients can't remember their own wisdom tooth extractions. Welser wasn't chasing fame, and he certainly wasn't chasing the particular brand of internet virality his molecule would eventually produce, the genre of recovery room videos where someone declares undying love for a houseplant. He was solving chemistry, methodically, in the unglamorous way real breakthroughs usually happen, one adjusted molecular ring at a time, in a lab that smelled like everywhere labs smell, faintly of solvent and ambition. And somewhere in that quiet Swiss evening, without any fanfare, without anyone clapping or popping champagne, the modern era of forgetting on demand quietly began. It sounds like a footnote, but that water solubility quietly solved one of anesthesia's most irritating problems. Older sedatives like diazepam had to be dissolved in propylene glycol just to survive inside a syringe, and injecting that mixture often felt like having battery acid politely introduced into your vein. Patients receiving diazepam for sedation frequently reported a sharp, burning sensation travelling up the arm, the kind of discomfort that makes you wonder whether the cure and the affliction have quietly switched places. Nurses developed all sorts of workarounds, injecting it slowly, diluting it further, choosing the largest vein available like they were trying to find the path of least resistance through a very small, very unhappy river. None of it fully solved the problem, because the problem wasn't technique, it was chemistry. Diazepam simply didn't want to be water-soluble, and propylene glycol, while an effective solvent, came with its own baggage, irritating tissue and occasionally causing more serious complications when given in large or repeated doses. Versed skipped the discomfort entirely, sliding into the bloodstream painlessly, and then crossing into the brain with the kind of efficiency most commutes can only dream of. Because midazolam could shift its solubility depending on its surroundings, it didn't need a harsh solvent riding shotgun. It travelled clean, dissolved comfortably in its syringe, slipped into the vein without complaint, and then, once it sensed the more neutral environment of the bloodstream, flipped its chemical wardrobe and became fat-soluble, allowing it to cross the blood-brain barrier with the casual confidence of someone who already knows they have the right credentials. This single property changed the entire patient experience of sedation. No burning, no wincing, no nurse apologizing in advance for what's about to happen to your arm. It also made midazolam dramatically more practical for emergency situations, where seconds matter and nobody has time to slowly titrate a painful injection into a patient who is, say, actively seizing. First responders could push it quickly, confidently, without worrying that the cure itself was going to cause its own minor crisis on the way in. It's a small, unglamorous detail in the grand story of a memory-erasing drug, the kind of chemistry footnote that never makes it into the dramatic recovery room videos, but it's the quiet reason an entire generation of patients got to skip the burning vein lottery their parents' generation had to play. Sometimes the biggest medical advances aren't about doing something more powerful. They're about doing the same thing, just without making the patient regret every step of getting there. After a decade of trials, the United States Food and Drug Administration approved midazolam under the brand name Versed in 1985, and American hospitals adopted it with the enthusiasm of someone discovering sliced bread. The approval process had stretched across years of careful study, dose-ranging trials, and the kind of bureaucratic patience that pharmaceutical companies both resent and quietly depend on, because nobody wants the alternative, a sedative rushed to market without anyone bothering to check whether it occasionally stops people from breathing. By the time the FDA signed off, midazolam had already built a reputation in Europe, where it had been used for several years prior, giving American physicians the rare comfort of adopting a drug with an actual track record rather than a hopeful theory. Hospitals didn't just like the new sedative, they restructured entire workflows around it. Procedures that once required general anesthesia, with its longer recovery times, higher costs, and need for a dedicated operating room, could suddenly be handled with a quick intravenous push of Versed in an outpatient setting. Endoscopy units, once cramped by the slow turnover of patients groggily recovering from heavier sedation, found themselves moving people through faster, sedating, performing, and discharging patients within a single morning instead of stretching procedures across an entire hospital stay. It was fast, it was short-acting, and unlike its predecessors, patients woke up from it relatively quickly instead of needing a nap that bled into the following afternoon. This single fact, the speed of recovery, turned out to be worth an enormous amount of money to a healthcare system that runs, fundamentally, on turnover. A drug that let patients walk out the door within an hour instead of requiring an overnight stay wasn't just convenient. It was an entire business model shift disguised as a chemical innovation. Within a few years, it became the quiet workhorse behind millions of procedures that nobody particularly wanted to be conscious for, slipping into routine use with the kind of invisibility that only the most successful medical tools achieve. The ones that become so standard, nobody bothers to ask how they got there. Patients rarely learn the name of the drug they'd been given. They simply experience the result, drifting in, drifting out, walking to the car an hour later with a vague sense that time had passed strangely. Doctors didn't market it to the public the way pharmaceutical companies marketed Valium decades earlier, with magazine ads promising relief from the daily grind. Versed never needed a marketing campaign because its real audience wasn't the patient. It was the hospital's schedule, and the schedule loved it instantly, unconditionally, and with the kind of quiet institutional affection usually reserved for things that make Tuesdays run on time. There's a peculiar medical category called conscious sedation, which is a phrase that sounds like a contradiction because it kind of is one. You're not under general anesthesia. You can technically respond to your name, follow simple instructions, and breathe entirely on your own. And yet you are, for all practical purposes, not really there. It's the difference between being asleep and simply declining to participate in your own life for the next 20 minutes. Anesthesiologists describe a kind of sliding scale, from fully alert at one end to fully unconscious at the other, with conscious sedation occupying a strange middle territory where the lights are on, but, to borrow the old joke, nobody is quite home to answer the door. Patients under conscious sedation can squeeze a hand on request, can open their eyes, can occasionally answer a question, though the answer might arrive a full beat later than expected, like a radio signal bouncing off a distant satellite before reaching you. The body remains functionally present, breathing on its own, maintaining its own blood pressure, doing all the unglamorous biological housekeeping that general anesthesia would otherwise require a machine to handle. But the mind, the part of you that would normally be tracking time, forming opinions, feeling embarrassed, has quietly stepped out for an extended coffee break. This middle ground exists because plenty of medical procedures don't actually require the patient to be fully unconscious. They just require the patient to not particularly care what's happening to them. A colonoscopy doesn't need a sleeping patient. It needs a patient who isn't going to flinch, panic, or remember the experience well enough to dread the next one. Conscious sedation threads that needle precisely, keeping the body cooperative and stable, while quietly evicting the part of the mind that would otherwise be keeping score. There's something almost philosophically unsettling about it if you sit with the idea too long. You can be present, responsive, capable of holding a conversation, and still be entirely, deliberately, chemically absent from the experience your own body is having. It raises an odd question that most patients never get around to asking, mostly because by the time they'd think to ask it, the drug has already made sure they won't remember wanting to. Is the version of you that follows instructions and answers questions during conscious sedation really you in any meaningful sense, if none of it survives into the version of you that wakes up afterward? Doctors don't lose much sleep over the philosophy. They just appreciate that it works, reliably, predictably, letting them operate on a patient who's technically awake and functionally somewhere else entirely, like a tenant who's paid rent on an apartment. They have absolutely no intention of remembering living in. Inside your brain, a chemical called GABA spends its days quietly telling neurons to calm down, acting like the most underappreciated security guard in your entire nervous system. GABA, short for gamma-aminobutyric acid, is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, meaning its entire job description is convincing overexcited neurons to take a breath and stop firing quite so enthusiastically. Without it, your nervous system would run hot constantly, every thought tangled up with every other thought, every sound amplified into chaos. GABA is the reason you can sit in a quiet room and actually experience it as quiet, rather than as an overwhelming symphony of every neuron in your skull trying to speak at once. Verst walks up to the GABA receptor and essentially props the door wide open, letting far more calming signal through than your brain ever asked for. Specifically, midazolam binds to a particular site on the GABA-A receptor, a kind of side door that doesn't activate the receptor directly, but instead makes the receptor far more sensitive to the GABA your brain is already producing. It's less like adding a new security guard, and more like handing your existing security guard a megaphone and a much bigger uniform, suddenly capable of shutting down far more activity than usual with far less effort. The result is a flood of chloride ions pouring into neurons, slowing them down so dramatically that anxiety, awareness, and the formation of new memories all grind to a halt at roughly the same time. Chloride ions carry a negative charge, and when they rush into a neuron, they make that neuron significantly less likely to fire, essentially turning the volume down on entire networks of brain activity simultaneously. This is why verse doesn't just calm you down the way a deep breath or a calming playlist might. It operates at the level of basic electrical signaling, intervening directly in the conversation your neurons are having with each other before that conversation even gets a chance to happen. The hippocampus, that small curved structure responsible for converting short-term experience into long-term memory, turns out to be particularly sensitive to this kind of inhibition, which is precisely why the amnesia hits so reliably, while other functions, breathing, basic motor control, the ability to mumble an answer to a simple question, remain comparatively intact. It's an elegant bit of biology, in the same way a perfectly aimed light switch is elegant. Simple, specific, and devastatingly effective at the one job it's designed to do. Your brain, normally a tireless record keeper, briefly clocks out, and for the duration of the drug's effect, it simply stops bothering to write anything down, leaving the rest of your body to go about its business completely unsupervised by any future version of you who might want the receipts. The specific kind of memory loss Versed causes has a name that sounds more intimidating than it is: anterograde amnesia. It doesn't erase your past. You'll still remember your childhood, your job, and the unfortunate haircut you got in college. What it erases is the present, blocking new memories from forming the moment it takes effect. You're fully conscious, fully responsive, and yet nothing happening to you is being saved to the hard drive. This is a critical distinction that most people get backward when they first hear about Versed, assuming it works like the dramatic memory wipe scenes in movies where someone's entire past gets scrubbed clean in a flash of light. Anterograde amnesia is the opposite direction entirely. Your past remains perfectly intact, sitting there in long-term storage exactly as it was before the drug entered your system. What's missing is the bridge between right now and tomorrow, the neurological process that would normally take the experience you're currently having and file it away for future retrieval. Think of your memory as a library with an extremely diligent librarian who, under normal circumstances, catalogues every single new book the moment it arrives. Versed doesn't burn down the existing library. It simply convinces the librarian to take an extended, blissfully irresponsible vacation, leaving every new experience that arrives during that window to pile up uncatalogued on the floor, eventually swept away entirely once the drug wears off. You can have an entire conversation during this window, laugh at a joke, ask a question, even ask the same question 3 times within 90 seconds, each time with the genuine enthusiasm of someone hearing fresh information, because as far as your hippocampus is concerned, each asking genuinely is the first. This produces some of the most reliably bizarre moments in modern medicine. Patients who carry on perfectly coherent conversations, follow instructions, express opinions, and then, the moment the drug clears, ask with complete sincerity whether the procedure has started yet, utterly unaware that it not only started but finished 40 minutes ago, while they were busy having opinions about the wallpaper. The phenomenon also explains why repeated reassurance works so well on anxious patients under Versed. You can tell someone the same comforting fact 5 separate times, and each time it lands as brand new information, immediately calming, immediately forgotten, an endless loop of fresh relief that never accumulates into actual memory but somehow does its job regardless. There's something almost generous about that particular quirk, a kind of built-in mercy where the comfort works perfectly well, even though it never gets to stick around long enough to matter. Anterograde amnesia, in the end, isn't really about forgetting at all. It's about a present moment that simply never gets the chance to become a memory in the first place, slipping quietly out of existence the instant it happens, like writing in sand at the exact moment the tide comes in. There is a uniquely modern genre of human experience that exists almost entirely because of Versed, the post-colonoscopy interview, in which a loved one films a groggy patient saying things they would never say, sober. Confessions about secret crushes, blunt assessments of in-laws, surprisingly detailed opinions on the nursing staff's footwear choices. The drug doesn't make people lie. It just removes the part of the brain that usually edits for an audience. The setting is almost always the same: a recovery bay, a thin curtain pulled halfway, a patient blinking slowly under fluorescent light, while a spouse or sibling leans in with a phone camera, and the particular gleeful energy of someone who knows they've stumbled into comedy gold. The questions are rarely cruel. They're curious, probing, gently mischievous, the verbal equivalent of poking a sleeping bear just to see what happens, except the bear, in this case, has been chemically relieved of its survival instincts, and is mostly just interested in discussing how nice the ceiling looks. Patients have been recorded declaring undying affection for their spouse, with a sincerity that somehow lands as both touching and slightly alarming, given that 30 seconds later they ask where their spouse is, apparently having forgotten the declaration occurred at all. Others launch into surprisingly detailed monologues about minor grievances: the brother-in-law who never returned a ladder, the neighbour whose dog barks too early, delivered with the gravity of a courtroom closing argument despite the actual stakes being approximately zero. The comedy works precisely because of the gap between conviction and consequence. A person under Versed speaks with total, unwavering confidence, completely untethered from any concern about how the statement will be received, because as far as their brain is concerned, there is no future in which this statement needs to be defended. It's the rhetorical equivalent of shouting into a canyon you're certain has no echo. Nurses, for their part, have developed an entire unspoken etiquette around this phenomenon, learning to keep their expressions neutral no matter what a patient announces, partly out of professionalism and partly out of self-preservation, because laughing too hard at a patient's drug-induced honesty is its own particular workplace hazard. The footage rarely gets shown to anyone outside the immediate family, mostly because what's funny in the moment, a parent confidently insisting they could beat a professional boxer, loses something in translation once the context disappears. What makes the colonoscopy confessional genre so enduring isn't cruelty, it's recognition. Everyone watching knows, somewhere in the back of their mind, that they too carry around a version of themselves who would say all of this, given the right chemical permission slip. Verst doesn't invent the unfiltered self. It just removes the lock on the door for 20 minutes, lets the rest of the family peek inside, films the results, and then quietly, mercifully locks the door again before the patient ever has to know what they confessed. Patients have stood up at the foot of their hospital bed and delivered entire monologues with the confidence of a best man at an open bar, only to ask afterward, with complete sincerity, whether the procedure has started yet. The disconnect is almost comedic. A fully animated, articulate human being operating with zero awareness that any of it is happening. Like a puppet show where the puppet is also somehow surprised by the puppet show. These episodes tend to follow a familiar shape. The patient, still tethered to an IV line and wearing a gown that offers minimal dignity at the best of times, becomes suddenly expansively talkative, holding forth on a topic with the unwavering certainty of someone who has clearly thought about this for years, even though the topic in question might be the superior merits of a particular brand of garden hose. The speech often arrives with full gestures, hand motions sweeping through the air despite an IV pole rolling along somewhere nearby. The rhetorical confidence of a person who believes, in this exact moment, that they have never made a more important point in their life. Family members watching this unfold experience a very specific kind of second-hand embarrassment mixed with genuine delight. The simultaneous urges to laugh and to apologize on the patient's behalf to absolutely nobody in particular, since nobody else present is sober enough to register the speech as remarkable in the first place. What makes these moments so reliably strange isn't just the content, it's the total absence of self-consciousness. A person who, under normal circumstances, might carefully calibrate every word in a public setting, suddenly speaks with the unguarded enthusiasm of a toddler explaining the plot of a cartoon, except the vocabulary belongs to an adult and the confidence belongs to someone running for office. There's a particular cruelty and tenderness wrapped together in watching someone you love do this, knowing they'll have absolutely no memory of it, knowing that whatever charming or embarrassing thing they just said exists now only in your memory, a private gift you'll get to bring up at dinners for years while they insist, genuinely baffled, that they would never say something like that. The asymmetry is the whole point. One person walks away holding a memory, the other walks away holding nothing but a vague feeling that time passed oddly and a faint craving for crackers. Doctors and nurses, having witnessed this exact scene more times than they could possibly count, rarely react with anything beyond a polite professional smile, the kind reserved for jokes they've already heard 1,000 variations of. But for the family in the room, it's pure, unrepeatable theatre, a brief window into a version of their loved one who exists nowhere else, performing with total conviction for an audience that, fittingly, includes absolutely no one who will remember the performance from the stage. In emergency rooms, Wurst earns its keep on patients who arrive in genuine crisis. A dislocated shoulder that needs to be popped back into place, a seizure that won't stop, a panic so severe the body has locked itself rigid. For these patients, the amnesia isn't a fun party trick, it's a mercy. Nobody particularly needs a vivid, unforgettable memory of the exact moment their shoulder was forced back into its socket. A dislocated shoulder, for anyone who's never had the particular pleasure, doesn't simply ache. It announces itself with a kind of deep, structural wrongness, the sensation of a joint that has clearly relocated to an address it was never meant to occupy. Reducing it, the medical term for guiding the joint back where it belongs, requires firm, deliberate pressure applied to a body that is, understandably, extremely reluctant to cooperate. Without sedation, the process is brutal for everyone involved. The patient bracing against pain that arrives in a single decisive wave, the physician working against muscles locked tight in pure defensive reflex. Versed changes the entire physics of the room. With the patient sedated, muscles relax, resistance fades, and the joint slides back into place with a fraction of the force and a fraction of the trauma that would otherwise be required. The reduction itself often takes mere seconds once the drug has taken hold, a sharp, clean motion followed by an audible, almost satisfying click, the joint settling back into its rightful home. The patient, mercifully, experiences none of the agony in any memory that survives the encounter, walking away later with a sling, a follow-up appointment, and absolutely no recollection of the maneuver that fixed them. Seizures present an even more urgent case. A seizure that refuses to stop on its own, a condition known as status epilepticus, represents a genuine medical emergency, the brain's electrical activity caught in a runaway loop that can cause real, lasting damage the longer it continues. Wurst act quickly enough in these situations to interrupt the seizure's electrical storm, calming the overactive neurons before they can do further harm. Administered through an IV, a nasal spray, or even injected directly into muscle when no vein is readily available, a flexibility that makes it genuinely useful in the chaos of an actual emergency, rather than the controlled calm of a scheduled procedure. Panic attacks severe enough to cause physical rigidity, the body essentially locking itself down in response to overwhelming psychological distress, also respond to Versed's particular brand of chemical interruption, breaking the feedback loop between racing thoughts and racing physiology before the body exhausts itself fighting an enemy that exists only in the nervous system's overreaction. In every one of these scenarios, the goal isn't comedy or convenience, it's interruption, stopping a body in crisis long enough for medicine to actually help it, and then, as a quiet side effect rather than the main point, making sure the worst of the experience never gets the chance to settle into permanent memory. Children scheduled for tonsillectomies or minor procedures are often given a dose of Versed in a flavoured liquid, sometimes nicknamed by nurses as the happy juice, and the results are reliably, gloriously unfiltered. A 6-year-old under its influence has been known to deliver philosophical monologues about cartoon characters, declare unprovoked love for the hospital ceiling tiles, or ask a perfectly serious question about whether dogs know their dogs. Pediatric sedation presents its own unique set of challenges, since children, unlike most adults, arrive at a hospital procedure with a fully active, fully terrified imagination and absolutely no patience for being told everything will be fine. The flavoured liquid version of Versed exists precisely because children will reliably refuse anything that requires an IV needle, but they'll happily drink something that tastes vaguely like cherry, blissfully unaware that the cherry flavouring is doing an enormous amount of quiet diplomatic work on behalf of modern medicine. Within minutes, the transformation begins, and it rarely looks like sedation in the way adults experience it. Instead of drowsiness, children often become strange little philosophers, suddenly fascinated by textures, colours, the precise geometry of hospital ceiling tiles, asking questions with the wide-eyed sincerity of someone encountering the universe for the very first time, partly because, neurologically speaking, they kind of are, since none of it is being filed away as a lasting impression. A child might earnestly inform a nurse that the stuffed animal they brought from home has feelings, and that those feelings should be respected, delivered with the gravity of a courtroom testimony. Another might ask, apropos of absolutely nothing, whether clouds get tired, and then forget asking the question within the same conversation, asking it again moments later with identical sincerity, the happy juice having generously reset the philosophical clock. Parents watching this unfold experience a particular kind of tender amusement, watching their child become briefly, harmlessly unmoored from ordinary logic, saying things they'd never say under normal circumstances, simply because the part of the brain responsible for social calibration has, temporarily, clocked out for the afternoon. The medical benefit underneath all the charm is serious and entirely deliberate. Children who might otherwise scream, struggle, and develop a lasting fear of hospitals from a single traumatic procedure, instead drift through the experience in a fog of mild, giggly wonder, emerging afterward with no memory of needles, no memory of fear, and ideally, no lasting aversion to the next paediatrician visit. It's a small mercy with enormous long-term value, sparing a child the kind of early medical trauma that can otherwise calcify into a lifelong dread of white coats and waiting rooms. The happy juice nickname, cooked up by nurses who've clearly seen this exact scene play out hundreds of times, captures something true about the experience even if it undersells the underlying chemistry. For 20 minutes, a frightened child becomes a tiny, sincere philosopher, asking the universe questions it has no intention of answering, blissfully unaware that by dinner time, none of it, the fear or the philosophy, will have survived the day. For patients who can't tolerate being slid into a long metal tube that hums and clangs like a haunted washing machine, Versed offers a quiet truce. Stay still, breathe normally, and let the anxiety simply not register. The machine is still loud. The tube is still narrow. You're just no longer the kind of audience who's going to remember being upset about it. Magnetic resonance imaging machines are, by any honest description, an engineering marvel wrapped in an experience that feels uncomfortably close to being slid into a coffin with excellent Wi-Fi. The tube itself rarely allows more than a few inches of clearance on either side, and the machine's internal mechanics produce a relentless series of clangs, buzzes, and thumps that sound less like medical equipment and more like someone repeatedly slamming a metal door inside your skull. For most patients, this is merely unpleasant, an endurance test measured in minutes. For patients with genuine claustrophobia, it can be genuinely impossible, the body's panic response overriding any rational understanding that the tube is, in fact, perfectly safe and entirely necessary for diagnosing whatever brought them there in the first place. Wurst steps in not by changing the machine, not by widening the tube or muffling the noise, but by changing the patient's relationship to the experience entirely. A modest dose taken before the scan dampens the anxiety response enough that the body, instead of flooding itself with panic the moment the tube swallows it whole, simply tolerates the situation with a kind of detached, mild curiosity. The noise is still there. The claustrophobia technically is still there too, in the sense that the physical conditions haven't changed at all. What's missing is the patient's capacity to fully register how unpleasant any of it is, and crucially, the capacity to remember it afterward well enough to dread the next appointment. This matters more than it might initially seem, because claustrophobia tends to compound itself. A patient who has one terrifying experience inside an MRI machine often arrives at the next appointment already primed for panic, the memory of the previous ordeal amplifying the anxiety before the tube has even come into view. By interrupting that memory formation, Wurst doesn't just make a single scan tolerable. It can prevent an entire cycle of escalating dread from ever taking root. Radiology departments have come to rely on this particular application heavily, since a panicked patient who needs to be pulled out mid-scan represents not just a failed appointment, but an enormous waste of expensive machine time that could otherwise be serving the next person in line. There's something almost touching about the trade being offered here. The machine doesn't get quieter. The tube doesn't get wider. The world remains exactly as loud and as narrow and as objectively unpleasant as it was before. The only thing that changes is the patient's ability to mind, and by the time they're wheeled out and asked how it went, most simply shrug and say it wasn't so bad, utterly unaware of the chemical diplomacy that made that sentence possible. In intensive care units, Versed is sometimes used not for a single short procedure, but as a continuous drip, keeping critically ill patients calm and tolerant of ventilators for days at a time. It's less a brief edit and more an extended grey nap, a long stretch of time that simply doesn't exist afterward for the person who lived through it, even though every hour of it absolutely happened. Patients on mechanical ventilation face a particular kind of physical indignity that the body instinctively resists. A tube inserted down the throat, breathing managed entirely by a machine, the natural gag reflex screaming in protest against an object that, under any other circumstance, would be considered an emergency. Without sedation, most patients would fight the ventilator constantly, coughing, gagging, struggling against a tube their entire nervous system has correctly identified as foreign and unwelcome, undermining the very treatment meant to keep them alive. Wurst, delivered continuously through an IV drip rather than a single push, keeps the patient calm enough to tolerate this arrangement for as long as medically necessary, sometimes a day, sometimes considerably longer, the drug maintaining a steady, low hum of sedation, rather than the sharp, brief wave used for a colonoscopy. This continuous approach changes the entire texture of the experience, both physiologically and eventually psychologically, for the patient who eventually wakes up from it. Where a single dose produces a tidy, contained gap in memory, days of continuous sedation produce something stranger and far less tidy. Patients have woken from extended ICU sedation with no coherent sense of how much time has passed, sometimes guessing hours when the true figure was days, sometimes guessing weeks when the true figure was considerably shorter, the brain's internal clock having essentially been switched off for the duration. Family members who have spent that entire stretch of time sitting in uncomfortable waiting room chairs, watching monitors, absorbing every agonizing update from doctors, often find this disconnect particularly difficult to witness. They lived every minute of the ordeal in full, vivid detail, while the patient at the centre of it experiences none of that same continuity, waking up confused about why everyone looks so exhausted and why so many days seem to have vanished without their permission. There's a strange asymmetry built into critical care that rarely gets discussed outside of medical circles. The people who suffer the most acute physical crisis often retain the least memory of it, while the people standing nearby, technically the bystanders, carry the entire weight of the experience forward into their own long-term memory, fully intact, fully vivid, for the rest of their lives. The patient gets the grey nap. The family gets the receipt. What works beautifully for 20 minutes in an endoscopy suite becomes a different animal entirely after days of continuous use. Prolonged sedation has been linked to ICU delirium, a disorienting fog of confusion and hallucination that can outlast the drug itself by weeks. Patients have described waking from extended sedation convinced they'd spent the missing time somewhere else entirely. A hotel, a prison, a boat, none of which technically existed. ICU delirium represents one of the genuinely uncomfortable trade-offs hiding behind the otherwise tidy story of Versid's amnesia. A drug that erases 20 minutes cleanly and harmlessly behaves quite differently when it's asked to erase several days, because the brain doesn't simply pause neatly during extended sedation. It continues operating in a strange degraded state, sometimes constructing entire false narratives to fill in gaps that the actual sensory environment, beeping monitors, fluorescent lights, the muffled voices of nurses changing shifts, never quite manages to satisfy on its own. Patients emerging from days of continuous sedation have reported astonishingly specific, fully formed memories of events that simply never happened. A stay at a seaside hotel complete with the smell of salt air. A period of detention in what felt unmistakably like a prison cell. A long boat journey across water that, as far as anyone else in their life can confirm, never occurred. These false memories don't arrive as vague impressions either. Patients often describe them with total conviction, the same unwavering certainty most people reserve for things they genuinely lived through, because as far as their own internal experience is concerned, they did live through them. The hallucinations appear to stem from a combination of factors working together against the patient's already compromised brain. The sedative itself, the underlying critical illness that put them in the ICU in the first place, sleep deprivation caused by a hospital environment that never actually goes dark or quiet, and the sheer sensory confusion of existing for days in a state that's neither fully conscious nor fully unconscious. The resulting delirium doesn't necessarily end the moment the sedation is stopped either. Cognitive effects have been documented persisting for weeks afterward. Patients struggling with confusion, attention problems, and a lingering sense of unreality long after they've technically returned to full consciousness and full memory formation. This has pushed modern critical care medicine toward a noticeably more cautious approach to continuous sedation than was standard a few decades ago, with many ICUs now actively working to minimize sedation depth and duration wherever possible, recognizing that the same drug capable of so cleanly erasing a brief colonoscopy can leave behind something far messier and more lingering when stretched across days. It's a sobering reminder tucked inside an otherwise almost charming story about forgetting. The line between a merciful gap in memory and a genuinely disorienting psychological aftermath turns out to be measured not in chemistry, but in time. There is an antidote of sorts, a drug called flumazenil that can yank a patient back from Versid's fog by blocking the very receptors the sedative was using. It's rarely used outside of emergencies, partly because reversing the drug too aggressively risks reversing the calm right along with it, leaving an anxious, half-recovered patient suddenly aware of everything they'd been blissfully unaware of moments before. flumazenil works through a deceptively simple mechanism. Rather than fighting VERST directly, it competes for the exact same binding site on the GABA receptor, essentially showing up and occupying the parking spot VERST was using, locking the benzodiazepine out without itself providing any calming or sedating effect of its own. It doesn't neutralize the drug chemically, doesn't break it down, doesn't speed up the liver's usual work of clearing it from the bloodstream. It simply crowds the molecule out of its favorite seat, leaving VERST circulating harmlessly in the body, with nowhere left to exert its influence. Like a guest who's shown up to a party only to discover every chair has been taken by someone else who arrived more aggressively. Administered through an IV, flumazenil can begin reversing sedation within a couple of minutes, a dramatic turnaround compared to the gradual, unhurried way midazolam normally wears off on its own. In a hospital corridor where minutes genuinely matter, that speed is the entire point. This makes it genuinely valuable in true emergencies, situations where a patient has received too much sedation and needs to be brought back to full alertness quickly, perhaps because breathing has become dangerously suppressed, or because some other urgent medical situation requires the patient to be conscious and responsive immediately rather than drifting back gradually over the next hour. An anesthesiologist watching oxygen saturation drop on a monitor doesn't have the luxury of waiting for the body to slowly metabolize its way back to normal. Flumazenil gives them an actual lever to pull, a way to intervene directly rather than simply hoping the trend reverses on its own. But the speed that makes flumazenil so useful in a crisis is also exactly what makes it risky to use casually. Reversing sedation too abruptly doesn't simply wake someone up gently. It can yank them back into full, unfiltered awareness of everything VERST had been quietly muting. The anxiety, the discomfort, sometimes even acute pain from whatever procedure was just performed, all arriving at once with none of the gradual cushioning a patient would normally get as the drug wears off naturally over time. Patients reversed too quickly have described the sensation as jarring, a kind of chemical rug pull, going from peaceful fog to wide-awake distress in the span of a couple of minutes, robbed of the gentle off-ramp their body would otherwise have been given, like being shaken awake mid-dream and expected to immediately answer trivia questions. It's the pharmacological equivalent of someone ripping a bandage off in one motion, instead of peeling it slowly, technically faster, considerably less pleasant. There's also a more technical complication that keeps flumazenil from being used as a casual undo button. Because it clears the body faster than midazolam does in many cases, there's a genuine risk of the patient sliding back into sedation once the flumazenil wears off, particularly if the original dose of VERST was substantial, creating a strange seesaw effect where alertness briefly returns, only to recede again, sometimes catching medical staff off guard if they assume the reversal is permanent. A patient might sit up, answer questions clearly, seem entirely back to themselves, only to drift back into drowsiness 20 minutes later as the flumazenil's shorter window closes while a larger reservoir of midazolam is still quietly circulating, waiting for its competitor to leave the stage. This means anyone given flumazenil typically needs to be monitored carefully for a stretch afterward, watched for exactly this kind of relapse, since the apparent recovery can be misleadingly convincing. There's also a more delicate specific risk in patients who use benzodiazepines regularly, whether for anxiety, seizure control, or alcohol withdrawal management, since their nervous systems have adapted to a baseline level of GABA amplification that flumazenil can abruptly strip away, occasionally triggering seizures in patients whose brains have come to depend on that constant chemical support. For these patients, flumazenil isn't a gentle correction. It's closer to pulling a load-bearing beam out of a structure that's been quietly leaning on it for months, and physicians approach its use in these cases with considerably more caution than they would with a patient who'd simply received a single outpatient dose for a colonoscopy. For these reasons, flumazenil remains something closer to a fire extinguisher than a light switch. Present, available, occasionally essential, but not something anyone reaches for casually just to speed along a routine recovery or satisfy a patient's impatience to get home sooner. Most patients who receive Versed are simply left to drift back to consciousness on their own timeline, the body gradually metabolizing the drug out of the system at its own pace, the recovery room offering little more than time, a blanket, and the occasional cracker, because it turns out that even rescuing someone from forgetting comes with its own set of risks worth respecting. And sometimes the kindest, safest thing medicine can do is simply wait for the fog to lift on its own schedule, rather than insisting it clear faster than the body's chemistry is comfortable allowing. Versed alone is relatively forgiving when it comes to breathing, but combine it with an opioid, and the math turns dangerous fast. Both drugs depress the part of the brainstem responsible for the simple, unglamorous task of telling your lungs to keep going. It's the reason procedural sedation comes with a pulse oximeter clipped to your finger and a nurse who never quite takes her eyes off the monitor. On its own, midazolam tends to produce a level of respiratory depression that most healthy patients tolerate without much issue, a mild slowing rather than a genuine threat, the kind of effect that lets hospitals administer it routinely without dedicating a full anesthesiology team to every single procedure. A patient given Versed alone might breathe a touch slower, a touch shallower, the kind of change a monitor notices long before the patient or anyone in the room would ever consciously register it as worrying. But medicine rarely uses Versed entirely on its own. For procedures involving any meaningful discomfort, a colonoscopy, an endoscopy, a dental extraction, physicians frequently pair it with an opioid like fentanyl, since the benzodiazepine handles the anxiety and amnesia, while the opioid handles the actual pain, a tag-team approach that works wonderfully for patient comfort, and considerably less wonderfully, if not monitored carefully, for the basic mechanics of breathing. The logic behind pairing them makes perfect clinical sense. Each drug is doing a job the other one isn't suited for, and together they produce a patient who is calm, comfortable, amnesic, and largely indifferent to whatever's happening to them, which is precisely the outcome everyone in the room is hoping for. The trouble is that both drug classes act on overlapping but distinct targets within the brainstem's respiratory control centers, and when combined, their depressive effects don't simply add together politely. They tend to synergize, producing a level of respiratory suppression considerably greater than what either drug would cause on its own at the same dose. It's not 1 + 1 = 2. It's closer to 1 + 1 = something that catches an unprepared physician genuinely off guard, a multiplication disguised as simple addition. This is precisely why every procedure involving sedation comes wrapped in monitoring equipment that would look, to an outside observer, disproportionately serious for something as routine as a tooth extraction. The pulse oximeter clipped to a patient's finger continuously tracks blood oxygen levels, watching for the telltale dip that signals breathing has slowed more than intended, while a blood pressure cuff and heart rate monitor round out a small constellation of devices, all quietly making sure the patient's vital signs stay within an acceptable range throughout the procedure. A capnography sensor, where available, tracks the carbon dioxide a patient exhales with every breath, often catching a slowdown in breathing even before the oxygen levels themselves begin to drop, giving staff an earlier warning than the pulse oximeter alone could provide. None of this equipment exists because anyone expects disaster. It exists precisely because the margin between comfortable sedation and dangerous over-sedation is narrower than most patients realize, and the only way to keep that margin safe is to watch it continuously, rather than trust that the combination will simply behave itself. The nurse stationed nearby isn't simply present for reassurance. She's actively watching numbers scroll across a screen, ready to intervene the moment a trend starts heading in the wrong direction, sometimes simply by reminding a patient to take a deeper breath, sometimes by adjusting the oxygen delivered through a nasal cannula, and in rarer, more serious cases, by reaching for that flumazenil or its opioid counterpart, naloxone, to reverse the combined effects before things escalate further. Dosing protocols have been refined over decades specifically around this interaction, with physicians typically reducing the dose of each drug somewhat when they're given together, anticipating the synergy rather than discovering it the hard way mid-procedure. This careful monitoring is the unglamorous, unremarked-upon infrastructure that makes the entire amnesia genre of medicine possible in the first place. The viral videos, the unfiltered confessions, the giggling 6-year-olds declaring love for ceiling tiles, all of it depends on a quiet, constant vigilance happening just out of frame, someone whose entire job during your procedure is to make absolutely sure that the part of your brain responsible for breathing doesn't follow the part of your brain responsible for memory into an extended, unscheduled vacation, however charming the rest of the experience might look from the outside. Somewhere in the pile of paperwork before your procedure was a consent form, signed in your own handwriting, agreeing to risks you read in a hurry and will never ever remember reading. There's something almost philosophically strange about it. A legally binding agreement made by a version of you who is about to be deliberately chemically erased. Informed consent forms are designed around a fairly straightforward principle that a patient should understand the risks of a procedure before agreeing to undergo it, and in most areas of medicine, this principle holds up reasonably well since the patient who signs the form is typically the same patient who lives with the consequences and retains full memory of having agreed to them. A patient who consents to a knee surgery remembers having read the risks, remembers the conversation with the surgeon, remembers the slightly nervous signature at the bottom of the page, and that continuous thread of memory is, in a quiet way, part of what gives the whole arrangement its moral weight. Versed quietly complicates this entire framework in a way that almost nobody pauses to consider while they're sitting in pre-op, half listening to a nurse explain risks they're already mentally filing under things I'll deal with later. You read the form, you nod along at the appropriate moments, you sign your name in the small line provided, and then, minutes later, a sedative arrives whose entire purpose is to make sure that the person who signed that form will have absolutely no recollection of having done so. The clipboard gets handed back, the pen gets clicked closed, and within the hour the entire transaction, reading, understanding, agreeing, signing, will exist nowhere in the patient's own mind, surviving only as ink on a page filed away in a hospital record system the patient will likely never look at again. The legal agreement remains perfectly valid, of course. Consent given while competent and informed doesn't evaporate simply because a later memory of giving it does. The law is, in this narrow sense, more forgiving of forgetting than our intuitions might initially suggest, recognizing correctly that the validity of a decision depends on the state of mind at the moment it was made, not on whether that moment survives into permanent memory afterward. A contract signed while sober remains binding, even if the signer later forgets signing it. Nobody seriously argues otherwise. But there's a genuinely odd philosophical wrinkle buried in there. The question of what it actually means for a person to consent to something when the very next chemical step in the process is designed to erase any trace of that consent from their own personal record. It's not unlike signing a contract moments before someone shreds your copy, except the shredder, in this case, is your own brain, working exactly as intended, exactly as the contract itself anticipated, an institution essentially building its own paper trail around a participant who will hold none of it. Patients rarely think about this distinction in the moment, mostly because the moment itself is engineered to be brief, efficient, and quickly followed by drowsiness, leaving little room for existential reflection on the nature of agreement and memory between the nurse's clipboard and the anesthesiologist's syringe. There simply isn't time, nor particularly much incentive to sit with a question that abstract while wearing a paper gown and waiting for a procedure to start. But it raises a genuinely interesting question about identity that philosophers have chewed on for far longer than Verst has existed. Are you, the person reading this sentence right now, meaningfully the same entity as the version of you who will sign a consent form next time you're wheeled into pre-op, given that the version doing the signing and the version who'll wake up afterward are connected only by a thread of paperwork rather than any continuous memory linking the two? It's a question that, stated plainly, sounds like the kind of thing debated in a university seminar at midnight. Yet it plays out quietly, unremarked, in outpatient surgical centres every single day, dozens of times an hour, across the entire country, with absolutely nobody pausing the line to discuss it. Most people resolve this question the same practical way they resolve most philosophical puzzles, by not thinking about it and signing the form anyway, trusting that whatever continuity matters legally and medically doesn't require their own brain to keep a personal copy of the receipt. There's a kind of quiet faith embedded in that decision, a willingness to let the hospital's paperwork carry the weight of a commitment your own memory will never be asked to corroborate. And most patients make that trade without a second thought, signing their name, handing back the pen, and trusting that somewhere, on file, in ink, a version of themselves they'll never get to consult again made the right call on their behalf. Oral surgeons reach for Verst when a wisdom tooth extraction calls for more than numbness and a stern pep talk. Patients have been known to hold entire conversations mid-extraction, occasionally asking the same question 3 times in 90 seconds, each time with the same fresh enthusiasm, like a houseguest who keeps walking into the same room and being delighted to discover it again. Wisdom tooth removal sits in an awkward zone of dental medicine, often involving teeth that haven't fully emerged, sometimes impacted at odd angles against the jawbone, requiring enough force and manipulation that local anaesthesia alone, while effective at numbing pain, does little to address the more general anxiety of feeling pressure, hearing unsettling cracking sounds, and being acutely aware that a stranger is currently working with tools inside your mouth. Local anaesthetic can deaden the nerve endings perfectly well, but it does nothing whatsoever for the part of the brain that registers, with mounting alarm, the specific sensation of being worked on, the tugging, the bracing, the occasional small crunch that travels through bone in a way no amount of numbness fully muffles. Verst steps in to handle the part local anaesthesia can't reach, the psychological experience of the procedure rather than the physical sensation of it, and the results, much like everywhere else this drug shows up, tend toward the gloriously unfiltered. Patients mid-extraction have been recorded asking their oral surgeon detailed questions about completely unrelated topics: the weather, a recent vacation, whether the surgeon has pets, conducting what amounts to polite small talk while actively having a tooth removed from their skull, utterly disconnected from any sense that the timing might be unusual, treating the entire procedure with roughly the social register of a long wait at the hair salon. The surgeon, hands occupied, often answers anyway, a strange one-sided rapport building over the course of an extraction the patient will never recall having initiated. The repetition phenomenon shows up here with particular charm, a patient asking with genuine curiosity whether the procedure has started yet, receiving an answer, nodding thoughtfully, and then asking the exact same question moments later, as though encountering the concept of dental surgery for the very first time all over again, each iteration delivered with the same earnest curiosity as the last, never once registering as repetition to the person asking. Some patients fixate on a single, oddly specific worry, asking repeatedly whether they'll be able to eat solid food again, or whether their face will look different afterward. The question looping back every 90 seconds with the patience of a record needle catching the same groove, the surgeon offering the same calm reassurance each time as if for the first time, because for the patient it genuinely is. Oral surgery offices have, over the years, developed something of a quiet appreciation for these moments, less because they find patient discomfort funny, and more because the alternative, a fully alert, fully anxious patient white-knuckling through the sound of their own tooth being extracted, represents a considerably worse outcome for everyone involved, surgeon and patient alike. An anxious, clenched jaw fights every movement the surgeon makes. A relaxed, distracted patient, content with their own small talk loop, simply lets the work happen. The sedation also solves a more practical problem unique to oral surgery. An anxious, tense patient tends to clench their jaw involuntarily, fight reflexively against pressure, and generally make the entire procedure more difficult and more time-consuming for the surgeon to perform safely. A relaxed jaw, even one technically still capable of speech, and the occasional misplaced question about the surgeon's weekend plans, allows the actual surgical work to proceed far more smoothly, turning what could be a tense, combative 30 minutes into something closer to a calm, cooperative one. The recovery room afterward often produces its own small highlight reel, groggy patients informing family members with great seriousness that the surgery was easy, actually kind of fun, a statement delivered with the conviction of someone who has no idea their face is currently packed with gauze and slightly swollen on one side, occasionally followed by an enthusiastic, slightly slurred recommendation that the family member they're addressing should also get their wisdom teeth removed sometime, just to see how fun it is. By the time the numbness wears off hours later and the actual discomfort sets in, the patient who insisted it was fun has long since checked out of the conversation, leaving a slightly more honest, considerably more sore future version of themselves to deal with the aftermath that Verst never bothered sticking around to remember. A quiet handoff between two versions of the same person who will never get to compare notes. Somewhere in the last decade, filming a loved one in the recovery room became an entire internet subculture, a genre with its own unspoken rules. Ask the patient something embarrassing, capture the confusion, wait for the unfiltered answer. It's a strange kind of comedy built entirely on the gap between a person's public self and the version that exists when the public self has been temporarily switched off. The genre follows a remarkably consistent format across thousands of recordings, almost as though everyone who's ever filmed one received the exact same unofficial instruction manual, passed down through some collective internet osmosis. The phone comes out the moment the patient starts stirring, held at a slight upward angle to capture the full, unguarded confusion on their face, the framing instinctively recognizing that the best material happens in those first disoriented seconds, before the social filter has even begun its slow, gradual reboot. The first question is usually gentle, an easy lob designed to test the waters. Do you know where you are? Do you know what day it is? Establishing a baseline of just how disconnected the patient currently is from ordinary reality. A kind of informal sobriety check disguised as casual concern. Once it becomes clear the patient is operating in full, uninhibited versed mode, the questions escalate, growing more pointed, more mischievous, fishing for exactly the kind of unguarded honesty that would never survive contact with a fully conscious brain. "Do you love me?" someone might ask, grinning just slightly, knowing the answer is coming with none of the careful hedging a sober spouse might offer after a minor disagreement that morning. "What do you really think of my cooking? Who's your favourite child?" The questions, harmless on the surface, are precision engineered to extract exactly the kind of statement that would normally require months of careful prodding or a few too many drinks at a holiday party. The appeal isn't cruelty. It's the rare, almost anthropological opportunity to witness a person completely stripped of their usual social armour, saying things with total conviction that they would spend considerable effort avoiding under normal circumstances. A husband emerging from a routine procedure has confidently informed his wife that he secretly thinks their neighbour's lawn looks better than theirs, an opinion he has apparently held in complete silence for years, rather than risk the minor domestic fallout of voicing it, delivered with the weary gravity of a man finally setting down a heavy burden. A teenager recovering from a dental extraction has earnestly explained an elaborate, entirely fictional plan to become a professional falconer, complete with a timeline and a list of required equipment, none of which survives past the car ride home, the entire ambition constructed and abandoned within the span of a single groggy afternoon. Another patient recovering from a minor outpatient procedure spent several minutes insisting with great sincerity that the recovery room curtains were in fact alive and watching, a claim delivered with such calm certainty that the family member filming briefly seemed to consider whether they should be more concerned than amused. The footage circulates within families the way old home videos once did, pulled out at holidays, replayed at birthdays, becoming a strange kind of shared inside joke built on a moment the actual subject of the joke has zero memory of participating in. Years later, a grown man might still be reminded, every Thanksgiving, of the time he woke from minor surgery and delivered a passionate, entirely sincere toast to his own car, a speech he has no memory of giving and no ability to dispute, having been thoroughly outvoted by video evidence. There's an interesting ethical undercurrent running quietly beneath all the laughter that most families never stop to examine closely. The person being filmed didn't consent to the performance in any meaningful sense, not because anyone acted maliciously, but because consent requires the kind of awareness Verst specifically removes, leaving the patient as the only person in the room who genuinely doesn't get a say in how the resulting footage gets used, shared, or replayed for years afterward. Most patients, when later shown the footage, react with a mix of horror and reluctant amusement, watching themselves say things they'd swear under oath they would never say, confronted with undeniable video evidence that some other version of them, briefly, said exactly that, with total confidence, to an audience that found it absolutely delightful, and who will, in all likelihood, never let them forget it, even though they themselves never had the chance to remember it in the first place. Because patients under Verst sometimes blurt out things they'd never normally say, a persistent myth has followed the drug for decades, that it functions as a truth serum, loosening lips and exposing secrets. In reality, it doesn't make anyone more honest. It just removes the social filter that usually decides what's worth saying out loud, which occasionally looks the same from the outside. The truth serum myth has a long, colourful history in popular culture, stretching back through decades of spy films and crime dramas where a shadowy figure injects a captured agent with some mysterious compound, after which the agent helplessly spills every secret they've ever held, voice flat, eyes glassy, betraying their entire organisation in a single chemically compelled monologue, usually just in time for the hero to burst through the door and overhear the crucial detail. Verst's reputation for producing unfiltered, occasionally embarrassing statements has made it an easy stand-in for this fictional trope, the closest real-world equivalent most people have ever personally witnessed, usually in a recovery room rather than an interrogation chamber. The gap between Hollywood's shadowy basement and a sunlit endoscopy suite somehow not quite enough to dismantle the comparison entirely. But the mechanism behind Verst's loose-lipped reputation has nothing to do with compelling honesty, and everything to do with simply removing the brain's usual filtering process. The constant, largely unconscious editorial work most people perform before any sentence leaves their mouth, weighing social consequences, professional appropriateness, whether grandma is in earshot. Under normal circumstances, this filter runs so smoothly and so automatically that most people never notice it operating at all, the same way nobody consciously thinks about blinking, until someone points out how often they're doing it. Dozens of times an hour a thought arrives, gets quietly evaluated against a lifetime of social calibration, and either gets spoken, softened, or simply discarded before it ever reaches the air, all without the speaker registering that any decision was made at all. Versa doesn't pry open some hidden vault of suppressed honesty. It simply switches off the editor, leaving whatever thought happens to be passing through in that exact moment to walk straight out the door, unsupervised, regardless of whether that thought happens to be a deep secret, a mundane observation about hospital ceiling tiles, or an entirely fabricated opinion the patient doesn't even actually hold, but said anyway, because nothing was there to stop it. This distinction matters enormously, because it means statements made under the versed carry no particular guarantee of truthfulness at all, a fact that has occasionally caused real legal and medical headaches when patient statements made during sedated states have been taken more seriously than they should be. A patient might confidently claim, mid-procedure, that they're allergic to a medication they've taken safely for years, not because the sedative revealed some hidden truth, but because the unfiltered, momentarily unsupervised brain simply generated a stray, incorrect thought and had nothing in place to stop it from becoming spoken word, a claim that, written down in a chart by a nurse trying to be thorough, could create confusion for weeks afterward. Other patients have confessed to crimes they plainly didn't commit, named affairs that never happened, or volunteered detailed, entirely invented backstories with the same flat confidence as someone reciting their actual birth date. The absence of an editor producing not concealed truth but simply unfiltered noise, some of it accurate, much of it not, none of it reliably distinguishable from the outside. Law enforcement and legal systems have generally, sensibly, declined to treat anything said under benzodiazepine sedation as reliable testimony, recognizing that an absence of filtering is not remotely the same thing as an abundance of accuracy. Courts have, on the rare occasions the question has come up, treated statements made under sedation roughly the way they treat statements made while sleepwalking, technically spoken by the person in question, but produced under conditions that strip away any meaningful claim to deliberate considered truthfulness. The myth persists anyway, fueled by decades of spy movies and an endless supply of recovery room footage that looks, on the surface, exactly like what a truth serum would produce, the patient speaking freely, confidently, without hesitation, exactly as fiction has long promised a truth serum should look, even though what's actually happening underneath is something considerably less dramatic and considerably stranger. Not the revelation of hidden truth, but the brief, total absence of any editor deciding what counts as worth saying at all, a difference that matters enormously to anyone trying to use the footage for something more serious than a laugh at Thanksgiving, but matters not at all to the patient themselves, who, by the time anyone asks them about it, has no memory of having spoken at all. In the 2010s, several American states began including midazolam in lethal injection protocols, hoping its sedative properties would render the process more humane. Instead, a series of prolonged, visibly distressing executions, including one in Oklahoma in 2014, raised serious questions about whether the drug was adequate for the role it had been assigned. Courts, pharmaceutical companies, and medical associations have been arguing about it ever since. The shift toward midazolam in execution protocols emerged from a genuine supply crisis rather than any new medical insight. States had previously relied on sodium thiopental, a fast-acting barbiturate, as the first drug in a 3-part lethal injection sequence. But European pharmaceutical manufacturers, increasingly opposed to having their products used for executions, began refusing to supply it, leaving states scrambling for an alternative that could plausibly render an inmate unconscious before the subsequent drugs caused death. Midazolam, already widely manufactured, readily available and familiar to anesthesiologists everywhere, seemed like a reasonable substitute on paper, a sedative capable of producing unconsciousness, paired with the same paralytic and cardiac stopping agent states had used for years. The problem turned out to be one of degree rather than concept. Midazolam, even at substantial doses, doesn't reliably produce the same depth of surgical level unconsciousness that a barbiturate like sodium thiopental does. It's an excellent sedative for short procedures where a patient needs to be calm and amnesic, considerably less proven as the sole agent for ensuring total insensitivity to pain during an execution, and that distinction, almost academic in a hospital setting, became suddenly urgently consequential in a different kind of room entirely. The Oklahoma execution in question became a focal point for exactly this concern, an event in which witnesses reported the inmate regaining visible consciousness, speaking, and appearing to experience significant distress well into the procedure, lasting considerably longer than executions are typically expected to take. Reporters present described a scene that bore no resemblance to the quick clinical event the protocol had promised on paper, and the gap between the procedure as written and the procedure as witnessed became the entire substance of the controversy that followed. The incident triggered immediate, intense scrutiny from medical professionals, civil rights organizations, and the courts, all asking variations of the same uncomfortable question. Had the state, in its search for an available substitute, selected a drug that simply wasn't equipped to do the specific, irreversible job it had been assigned? Anesthesiologists pointed out, somewhat pointedly, that midazolam was never designed nor tested for this purpose. Its entire reputation, the one built across decades of safe routine hospital use, rested specifically on situations where the drug's job was temporary, monitored, and reversible if anything went wrong, conditions that bear no resemblance whatsoever to a lethal injection chamber, where there is no flumazenil waiting in reserve and no pulse oximeter feeding back a warning anyone intends to act on. Subsequent legal challenges work their way through multiple court systems, with several justices and legal scholars weighing in on whether midazolam's use constituted cruel and unusual punishment given the documented uncertainty about its reliability at the doses and circumstances involved. Expert witnesses on both sides produced competing studies, competing dosage charts, competing interpretations of the same underlying pharmacology, the kind of dueling testimony that leaves a courtroom with more paperwork than clarity. Some states responded by increasing the dose further still, betting that a sufficiently large amount could compensate for the drug's inherent ceiling effect, an approach that satisfied almost no one, since a higher dose of an imperfect tool is still, fundamentally, an imperfect tool. Other states quietly abandoned midazolam altogether, searching instead for entirely different drug combinations or, in some cases, reconsidering the method of execution itself, rather than continuing to patch a protocol built on a substitution nobody had originally intended to make permanent. The debate never reached a tidy resolution, continuing to surface in state legislatures and federal courtrooms in the years that followed, a strange and uncomfortable footnote attached to a drug whose primary cultural reputation, everywhere else it's used, remains gentle confusion, giggling children, and embarrassing recovery room confessions rather than the considerably darker question of whether it's capable of doing, reliably and humanely, the one job a hospital would never, under any circumstance, ask it to do. It's a jarring, tonal whiplash for a single molecule to carry, the same chemical responsible for a 6-year-old's philosophical musings about ceiling tiles also finding itself in an entirely different room with entirely different stakes, at the centre of a constitutional argument about suffering. Verst didn't ask for either job. It was simply available, effective at one of them, and quietly, controversially overextended into the other. Ask any nurse who's worked procedural sedation long enough, and they'll have a small private collection of the strangest things a patient has ever said while under Versid's influence. Marriage proposals to anesthesiologists, detailed grocery lists recited like scripture, entire conversations conducted with someone who wasn't in the room. It's an occupational hazard nobody warns you about in nursing school. Becoming an accidental confidant to people who will never remember confiding in you. Nurses who spend their careers in endoscopy units, oral surgery offices and outpatient procedure centres develop, almost without choosing to, an entire informal archive of the strangest sentences ever uttered by patients drifting in and out of midazolam's fog. The stories get traded quietly during breaks, in the same way other professions trade war stories, except these particular war stories tend to involve a patient earnestly proposing marriage to a startled anesthesiologist they met 90 seconds earlier, full of conviction, complete with a heartfelt explanation of exactly why this connection feels different from all the rest. An explanation that, to the patient in the moment, sounds entirely reasonable and entirely sincere. Other patients have been recorded reciting entire grocery lists with the rhythmic, almost liturgical seriousness of someone reading scripture aloud. Milk, eggs, the good kind of bread, repeated several times with subtle variations as though refining the list for some unseen, increasingly demanding audience, occasionally pausing to clarify, with great solemnity, that the bread in question must specifically be the seeded kind, never the plain. Some of the strangest moments involve patients carrying on entire conversations with people who simply aren't present in the room at all, addressing an empty chair with the same casual familiarity they might use with an old friend, occasionally pausing as though waiting for a response, nodding along to silence with total conviction that a conversation is actively taking place, sometimes even laughing warmly at whatever the empty chair has apparently just said. Nurses learn early on to keep their faces carefully neutral during all of this, a skill that takes considerable practice, because the line between professional composure and uncontrollable laughter is thinner than most people realize when a sedated patient solemnly informs you that their toaster has been plotting against them for years, delivered with the flat, weary certainty of someone finally unburdening a long-held suspicion. There's a particular kind of intimacy built into this work that doesn't exist in most other medical specialties, an intimacy entirely one-directional and entirely temporary. The nurse hears the marriage proposal, the grocery list, the imaginary conversation, absorbs it as a small private moment of genuine human strangeness, and then watches the patient wake up an hour later completely unaware that any of it occurred, asking instead whether the procedure has started, blissfully unaware they've already confided things to a stranger that they've never told their own spouse. Some nurses describe it as a kind of one-way mirror, watching an entire unguarded performance that the performer themselves will never get to review, a strange professional privilege that comes with an equally strange professional discretion, since very little of what gets said in that fog is meant, in any conscious sense, to be shared with anyone. Some nurses keep a private mental list of favourites, the funniest, the sweetest, the most baffling, trotting them out occasionally at staff parties the way other people share stories about their pets. The patient who insisted he was actually a retired astronaut. The woman who spent 20 minutes negotiating peace terms with a houseplant. Patients, for their part, almost never learn what they said unless someone specifically tells them afterward, leaving an entire invisible archive of human honesty scattered quietly across recovery rooms everywhere, witnessed only by the medical staff fortunate, or perhaps unfortunate, enough to have been standing nearby with a clipboard and a carefully neutral expression at exactly the right moment, holding a small piece of someone else's unguarded self that the someone else will never get to claim back. Unlike opioids, or even some other benzodiazepines, Verst never developed much of a street presence. Its effects are short, its administration usually requires an IV, and frankly, nobody's chasing the sensation of forgetting 20 minutes of their own life for recreational purposes. It remains almost entirely confined to hospitals, one of the rare modern sedatives that stayed exactly where it was invented to be used. This particular fact sets Versed apart from a long, troubled history of pharmaceuticals that escaped their intended medical purpose and found a second, far darker life on the street. Opioids built entire black markets around the pursuit of euphoria, a feeling people actively sought out and were willing to risk everything to chase, repeatedly. The warmth and relief arriving reliably enough and memorably enough to be worth pursuing again and again regardless of cost. Other benzodiazepines, particularly longer-acting ones like Xanax, developed substantial illicit followings precisely because their calming, anxiety-melting effects lasted long enough to be genuinely enjoyable, savoured, sought after, traded among people looking for sustained relief from their own racing thoughts, a feeling worth remembering, worth craving, worth seeking out a dealer for on a Tuesday afternoon. Versed's chemistry, the very same properties that make it so beautifully suited to hospital procedures, work directly against any potential recreational appeal. Its effects arrive quickly and leave quickly, offering at most a brief window of calm before the body clears it from the system entirely, leaving behind nothing to chase or extend, no lingering glow worth pursuing a second time, no afternoon stretched comfortably into evening the way a longer-acting benzodiazepine might offer. The amnesia itself, rather than being a desirable feature for recreational users, actively works against habitual use, since a drug experience nobody remembers having is, almost by definition, a difficult experience to crave. People seek out recreational substances partly for the sensations they produce in the moment, but largely for the memory of those sensations, the anticipation built around recalling how good something felt the last time, a psychological loop that Versed structurally cannot support, given that it specifically erases the very memories that would otherwise fuel that anticipation. It would be, in a sense, the worst possible product for a dealer to sell, since the customer would have no recollection of having enjoyed it, and therefore no particular reason to come back for more, an entire business model collapsing under the weight of its own pharmacology. There's also the simple practical barrier of administration. Most recreational drug use happens through routes that don't require medical equipment, swallowed pills, snorted powder, smoked substances, methods accessible outside of a clinical setting, requiring nothing more than privacy and a steady hand. Versed, by contrast, is typically administered intravenously, requiring not just a needle but specifically a vein-accessed line, a considerably higher barrier to casual use than simply popping a pill, and one that effectively confines the drug's practical use to settings where trained medical staff are already present and managing the process. Even in its rare instances of diversion, hospital staff occasionally misusing supply, the appeal tends to be the brief calm itself rather than anything resembling a sought-after high, and the lack of memory afterward makes even that motivation a strange, self-defeating one. This combination, short duration, no lingering euphoria, an experience too brief to properly remember enjoying, and an administration method that requires genuine medical infrastructure, has kept midazolam almost entirely free from the kind of illicit trade that has plagued so many of its pharmaceutical relatives. It remains, decades after its creation, exactly where Armin Walzer's careful chemistry first placed it, inside hospitals, inside procedure rooms, doing precisely the unglamorous, forgettable job it was designed to do, with no interest whatsoever in moonlighting anywhere else. A rare case of a drug staying obediently in its lane for its entire working life. For patients who receive Versed repeatedly over extended hospital stays, the body can begin adjusting to its presence, requiring higher doses to achieve the same effect, and occasionally producing withdrawal symptoms when it's finally stopped. It's a quieter, more clinical version of dependence than the ones that make headlines, playing out almost entirely behind hospital curtains rather than in public view. Tolerance develops through a fairly predictable biological process, the brain gradually adjusting its own GABA receptor sensitivity in response to repeated, prolonged exposure to a drug that's been artificially amplifying that system's effects for days or weeks at a stretch. The receptors essentially recalibrate, becoming somewhat less responsive over time, which means the same dose that produced effective sedation on day 1 might barely register by day 5, forcing physicians to gradually increase the dose simply to maintain the same clinical effect. A slow upward creep that mirrors, in a much more controlled and medically supervised way, the same basic mechanism underlying dependence on far more notorious substances. It's the body's own quiet negotiation tactic, adjusting its terms behind the scenes without ever announcing the change, until a doctor checking the chart notices the dose has crept up considerably from where it started and realizes the brain has simply moved the goalposts. This typically occurs in patients receiving continuous sedation in intensive care settings, rather than the brief, single-dose use common in outpatient procedures, since tolerance requires sustained, repeated exposure rather than the quick in-and-out encounter most patients have with the drug during a colonoscopy or wisdom tooth extraction. A patient sedated for an afternoon never gives their receptors enough time to adapt. A patient sedated continuously for 2 weeks on a ventilator gives them more than enough opportunity, and the body, ever efficient, takes that opportunity without asking permission. Withdrawal, when it does occur, tends to surface once a patient who's been sedated continuously for an extended period has the drug abruptly stopped or rapidly tapered. The nervous system, having spent days or weeks adjusted to an artificially amplified calming signal, suddenly finding itself without that signal and reacting with the kind of rebound hyperexcitability that benzodiazepine withdrawal is generally known for. Anxiety, tremors, occasionally seizures in more severe cases, the brain essentially overcorrecting in the opposite direction after losing the chemical support it had quietly grown to depend on, like a structure that's had its scaffolding removed all at once rather than gradually. Hospital staff have developed careful, gradual tapering protocols specifically to avoid this outcome, slowly stepping down the dose over time rather than stopping abruptly, giving the nervous system a chance to readjust at a pace that doesn't trigger the kind of dramatic rebound that an abrupt halt might cause. The tapering itself can stretch across days, a slow, deliberate withdrawal of support measured in small percentage decreases, the medical equivalent of letting someone gradually put their own weight back on a leg rather than yanking the crutch away mid-step. This entire phenomenon rarely makes it into public conversation about VERST, largely because it occurs almost exclusively within the contained, heavily monitored environment of intensive care units, rather than anywhere a patient might encounter it casually, and because the patients experiencing it are typically critically ill to begin with, their dependence on a sedative becoming a fairly minor footnote within the much larger story of whatever serious medical crisis put them there in the first place. It's a strange, quiet kind of dependence, born not from craving or pursuit, but from simple, sustained chemical exposure, the body doing exactly what bodies do when repeatedly handed the same signal long enough, adjusting, adapting, and eventually needing more of the same signal just to register that anything has changed at all. A long, unglamorous goodbye that almost nobody outside the ICU ever hears about. There's something almost poetic about a sedative whose primary legacy is the deliberate erasure of time itself. Decades of medical history, millions of procedures, countless small human dramas have all unfolded under its influence, and almost none of it survives as memory. VERST doesn't just treat anxiety, It treats the very experience of having lived through something. Consider the sheer scale involved here. The staggering number of individual human experiences that have occurred specifically because of this one small vial since its approval. Colonoscopies performed on nervous retirees, wisdom teeth extracted from anxious teenagers, dislocated shoulders reduced in chaotic emergency rooms, children calmed before tonsillectomies, claustrophobic adults guided through MRI machines, each one a complete, fully lived stretch of consciousness, full of sensation, sound, conversation, occasionally genuine fear or genuine comedy, and almost every single one of them has simply vanished from the personal record of the person who lived it, as thoroughly and as quietly as breath leaving a room. There's no other substance in ordinary medical use that operates with quite this particular philosophical strangeness, treating not the underlying condition that brought someone to the hospital, but the act of remembering having been there at all. A painkiller treats pain, an antibiotic treats infection, a blood pressure medication treats blood pressure. Verse treats experience itself, intervening not at the level of sensation, but at the level of memory formation, making the case that sometimes the kindest medical intervention isn't to prevent something unpleasant from happening, but simply to prevent it from sticking around afterward. A strange inversion of how most of medicine works, fixing the present by quietly editing the future's relationship to it. Multiply this single mechanism across decades of widespread hospital use, and you arrive at something genuinely strange to contemplate. An enormous, invisible archive of human experience that technically happened, that occupied real time, real consciousness, real sensation, but that exists nowhere now except in the charts, monitors, and occasional recovery room footage that briefly captured what the patient's own brain declined to keep. Somewhere out there exists a vast, uncounted collection of jokes told, questions asked, small confessions made, entire half-hour stretches of genuine human personality on full, unfiltered display, none of it retrievable by the very person who generated it, all of it gone the way morning dew disappears the moment the sun gets high enough to matter. Think of every recovery room conversation that's ever happened, every grocery list recited like scripture, every marriage proposal extended to a startled anesthesiologist, every 6-year-old's solemn opinion on whether clouds get tired, stacked end to end across 40 years of hospital use, an entire shadow library of human moments that existed fully and completely, and then simply declined to leave a copy behind. It raises a quietly unsettling question about what experience actually means if it leaves no trace behind in the person who had it. Did you really go through something if you can't, in any meaningful sense, go back and check? If the only evidence it ever happened lives exclusively in someone else's memory, or in a phone video you'll later watch with the bewildered detachment of a stranger reviewing someone else's life. Verse seems to answer, quietly and without fanfare, that the having of an experience and the remembering of it are simply two separate transactions, and that medicine, for better or worse, learned decades ago exactly how to interrupt the second one without ever touching the first, leaving behind a drug whose greatest achievement is, in the most literal sense possible, making time disappear. Maybe the strangest thing this small vial reveals isn't about hospitals at all, but about memory in general. The unsettling realization that being present and remembering being present are two entirely separate experiences, stitched together so seamlessly most of us never notice the seam, until a tiny dose of verse quietly pulls the thread. Most people walk through their entire lives assuming memory works like a continuous recording, every moment automatically captured and filed away the instant it happens, available for later retrieval whenever needed, the same way you'd assume a security camera is recording simply because the little red light is on. Verst exposes with startling clarity just how wrong that assumption actually is. Being conscious, it turns out, is not the same thing as remembering having been conscious. Two processes that feel completely fused together under normal circumstances, but that medicine has discovered, through one very specific small molecule, can be cleanly separated whenever someone decides it would be useful to do so, the seam revealing itself only when something deliberately pries it open. You can be fully awake, fully responsive, capable of carrying on a conversation, forming opinions, laughing at a joke someone tells you, and all of it can simply evaporate the moment the experience ends, leaving no trace whatsoever in the part of your brain that would otherwise be expected to hold on to it. This raises a quietly profound question that most people never get around to sitting with, mostly because by the time the relevant experience occurs, the drug has already ensured they won't think to sit with it afterward. A closed loop of forgetting that conveniently forgets to remind you it happened at all. If a version of you existed for 20 minutes, fully present, fully active, fully you in every observable sense, but that version leaves behind absolutely no continuous thread connecting it to the you who exists tomorrow, in what sense did that version's experience actually happen to you at all, rather than simply happening briefly to a temporary occupant of your body who happened to share your face and your voice and for 20 minutes a fairly strong opinion about your toaster's intentions? Philosophers have debated questions of continuity and identity for centuries without the benefit of a drug this precise to test their theories against, wrestling with thought experiments about teleportation and duplication and ships rebuilt plank by plank, never quite imagining that the answer might eventually arrive in a small glass vial on a hospital tray. Wurst offers something close to a controlled experiment, repeated millions of times across hospitals worldwide, in the strange territory between presence and memory, a real-world demonstration playing out daily in recovery rooms that no philosophy seminar could ever quite replicate. It suggests, gently and without any particular drama, that the seamless feeling of continuous selfhood most people carry around every day is something closer to a beautifully constructed illusion than a guaranteed fact of consciousness, a seam so well hidden that it takes a small glass vial and a careful chemist's adjustment to a molecule's solubility to reveal that it was ever there at all. Most people will never personally test this idea outside of a hospital setting, never have reason to wonder whether the person who walked into pre-op and the person who walked out an hour later are, in some deep philosophical sense, exactly the same continuous self. And perhaps that's for the best, since some questions are more comfortable left unexamined in the daylight. And so tonight, as you drift towards sleep yourself, with every intention of remembering absolutely nothing about the next several hours either, perhaps that's not such an unfamiliar feeling after all. Sleep does, gently, every single night, something not entirely unlike what Versed does sharply, in a syringe, under fluorescent light. It lets you be present for something, and then, with a quiet, practiced mercy, declines to let you keep it. Tomorrow morning, you'll wake up with no memory of the hours that just passed, no record of whatever your brain got up to in the dark, and you won't think it strange at all, because this particular vanishing act, unlike the one in the hospital, you've already learned every single night of your life to trust completely. So here you are, at the end of a day that never quite happened to anyone the way it happened to you. We followed a single small vial from a Swiss laboratory in 1975 all the way through gurneys and operating bays and ICU drips and dentist chairs and recovery rooms, with phones held at exactly the right angle. And what we found underneath all the chemistry wasn't really a story about medicine at all. It was a story about time, and how strange it is that time can fully happen to you, every second of it, and still leave behind absolutely nothing for you to keep. You laughed under Wurst. You answered questions you'll never remember being asked. Somewhere, in some recovery room you've long forgotten, A nurse may have heard you propose marriage to a complete stranger, or recite a grocery list like scripture, or hold a long, tender conversation with an empty chair. And she carried that small piece of your unguarded self quietly back to her station, filed under things nobody else will ever know about you, including you. There's something almost generous about a drug whose entire purpose is to let you be present without the burden of having to carry it afterward. We've spent centuries building tools to numb pain, but versed does something a little stranger and a little kinder. It lets the experience happen in full, every sensation, every word, every flicker of fear or boredom or comedy, and then it simply declines to let any of it cost you anything later. No nightmares about the colonoscopy, no flinch reflex at the dentist's chair, no memory of the shoulder being forced back into its socket, just a sling, a follow-up appointment, and a strange gap where an ordeal used to be. It's a peculiar kind of mercy, one that doesn't erase suffering so much as quietly refuses to let suffering follow you home. Think back for a moment on everything that small glass vial touched tonight. Think of the frightened patient on the gurney with mismatched socks, certain she wasn't nervous in the exact tone of someone who very much was. Think of the long, blunt history that came before her, the whiskey and the leather straps and the surgeons racing the clock instead of racing toward mercy. An entire profession built around speed because speed was the only kindness available. Think of the labouring women a century ago given morphine and scopolamine and told that forgetting their own childbirth was itself a form of grace. Restrained to beds because their bodies kept moving long after their minds had quietly excused themselves from the room. Think of the chemist in Basel, hunched over a flask on some unremarkable evening, solving a small, unglamorous problem about solubility, never imagining that his careful adjustment to one molecular ring would one day be the reason a 6-year-old somewhere confidently informs a nurse that the ceiling tiles have feelings. It's worth sitting with all of it for a moment before you drift off, because tonight's story, more than most, has been about the quiet machinery running underneath ordinary human experience, the kind we almost never notice until something deliberately interrupts it. Somewhere behind every procedure we talked about was a person who didn't want to be there, who was scared in the particular, ordinary way people get scared of needles and tubes and waiting rooms, and who got to walk out the other side without that fear ever fully landing. The frightened child given flavoured happy juice before a tonsillectomy doesn't grow up carrying a lifelong dread of hospitals. The claustrophobic adult slid into the MRI tube gets the scan they needed without the panic that would have made it impossible. The patient with a dislocated shoulder gets the joint set back into place without the singular, searing memory of the exact moment it happened. The patient on the ventilator fighting a tube their entire nervous system correctly identified as foreign gets to tolerate the very thing keeping them alive instead of fighting it every single hour. None of that is nothing. It's just easy to overlook because the whole point of it is that you're not supposed to notice it happened at all. And isn't that its own kind of resilience, in a smaller, quieter key than the kind we usually celebrate? We tend to admire endurance that's remembered, the marathon finished, the surgery survived and retold at dinner for years afterward. But there's a different, less celebrated kind of endurance happening in every recovery room every single day. A body going through something hard, something the mind would otherwise flinch from, and simply getting through it, unwitnessed even by its own future self. The patient doesn't get a story to tell about their colonoscopy. They get something better, in a way. Nothing to tell at all. No scar tissue left on the part of them that remembers things. Just a clean, quiet gap where the hard part used to be. Medicine spent centuries learning how to dull pain. It took considerably longer to learn how to dull the memory of it, and there's a strange tenderness buried in that achievement once you really look at it. There's also something quietly humbling in everything we learned about the limits of all this, because nothing this kind comes without edges. The drug that handles a routine procedure beautifully turns into something far messier and more uncertain when stretched across days in an ICU, producing confusion that can outlast the sedation itself by weeks. Hallucinated hotels and boats and prisons that felt, to the people who lived through them, every bit as real as the room they were actually lying in. Families who sat through every agonizing hour of a loved one's hospital stay carry forward a memory their loved one will never share, an asymmetry that nobody quite chose and nobody can undo. The same molecule that calms a 6-year-old's fear of a tonsillectomy became, in an entirely different room with entirely different stakes, the centre of a genuine constitutional argument about whether it was ever built to do a job far heavier than the one it was designed for. Versed never asked for either extreme. It was simply available, effective in its narrow lane, and occasionally, uncomfortably, asked to do far more than its chemistry could promise. Even the gentlest tools, it turns out, have a ceiling, and pretending otherwise helps no one. But mostly, what tonight leaves us with is a small, strange wonder about memory itself. The realization that being present and remembering being present are two entirely different things, stitched together so seamlessly in ordinary life that most of us never notice the seam until something as simple as a syringe quietly pulls the thread. You've lived through plenty tonight that you'll never get to revisit, and in a way, so has everyone who has ever closed their eyes for the night and trusted that the hours afterward would simply take care of themselves. Sleep does something gentler, but not entirely unrelated to what Versed does sharply, letting you be present for something, and then, without any fuss, declining to let you keep it. Every night of your life you've been quietly practicing this exact trick, handing over consciousness to the dark and trusting, without ever really thinking about it. That morning will arrive and sort the rest out. So as you settle in now, however you finally land tonight, maybe spare a small quiet thought for the strange machinery hidden inside your own skull, the one that has been quietly deciding your entire life what gets kept and what simply passes through unrecorded. Spare a thought too for everyone who came before the syringe and the flavoured happy juice and the careful monitoring equipment, the patients biting down on leather straps, the women restrained through labours they'd never recall, the long centuries where pain simply had to be lived through in full, with no chemical mercy waiting on a tray nearby. Be grateful, in whatever small way feels right, for living in an era where forgetting can be offered as kindness rather than left to chance, where a frightened person facing something painful doesn't have to carry the whole weight of it forward into tomorrow. There is a strange, soft comfort in that thought, the idea that some of the hardest moments don't have to become permanent residents of your mind, that some of them are allowed, gently and on purpose, to simply pass through and disappear, the way fog lifts off a field by mid-morning without anyone having to ask it to. And on that note, let the room go quiet now. Let the thoughts that arrived with you tonight loosen their grip the way thoughts do right before sleep finally takes hold, drifting, dissolving, sliding past the edge of memory without protest. You don't need to hold on to any of it. You don't need to remember the chemist in Basel, or the gurney, or the ceiling tile shaped like a state you've never visited. Let it all settle into the same soft, forgiving fog that has carried so many other people gently through so many other nights, asking nothing of you except that you let go. Whatever you carry into tomorrow, let it be lighter than what you carried into tonight. Sleep well and let the rest of it gently go.